The sun bled gold and rust over Cedar Bluff, but John Lone Tree didn't notice. He rode his sorrel mare down the main street, a ghost in the morning light. The men on the post office porch watched him, their coffee cups frozen halfway to their lips. They always watched. It didn't matter that he owned 200 head of cattle, that his fences were clean, that his word was solid as granite. All they saw was his name, his face, the copper in his skin that spoke a language they refused to learn. He said, "Morning," low and rough like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. They didn't answer. They never did. He dismounted at Jackson's Feed and Supply, the smell of burlap and leather oil thick in the air. He grabbed his salt, his wire, his nails, paid in silence, stepped back into the punishing sun, and that's when he saw her. She was wrestling two heavy flour sacks, her small frame straining under the weight. Her dress was patched, her boots were worn, but her jaw was set with a stubborn fire that burned brighter than the morning sun. He'd seen that fire before, in cornered animals and dying embers. It was the fire of survival. Then her boots snagged on a broken board. She stumbled, a small hiss of pain escaping her lips as one sack slipped. She caught it before it hit the dirt, but the effort cost her. He could see the tremor in her arms, the flash of agony in her eyes. He stepped off the porch without a thought. "Need a hand?" Her head snapped around. Her eyes, green as pine in deep shade, narrowed on him. Fierce, wary. "I can manage." Her voice was quiet, but it had an edge like a freshly sharpened blade. "You following me?" "No, ma'am," he said, his own voice soft. "Just saw you stumble." "I didn't stumble." He just nodded once. "All right." The silence stretched between them, thick with dust and unspoken words. She studied his face, searching for something. Pity, pride, something ugly, but she found none of it. "You're Lone Tree," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "My name's Ruth Callahan." He touched the brim of his hat, a simple gesture of respect. She watched him a second longer, then hoisted the sack higher on her shoulder and walked away. He didn't follow. He just watched. Just before she turned the corner at the mill, she glanced back. It was barely a flicker, a brief meeting of eyes across a dusty street, but it was enough. That glance landed in his gut like a stone. He knew the Callahan name, knew about the drunk father and the land that was bleeding them dry. He knew the town's whispers, but he also knew what he'd just seen. A fighter. He mounted his horse, his supplies tied behind him. As he rode out of town, he took the long way, past the Callahan place. It was a sorry sight. A leaning fence, a crooked chicken coop, a porch that sagged like a tired old man. He should have kept riding. He should have gone back to his own land, his own silence, his own life. But he didn't. Instead, he stopped his horse and stared at the fence. And that's when he saw it. Carved into the corner post, almost hidden by weeds and decay, was a symbol, a circle with a jagged line striking through it, like a tiny bolt of lightning. He'd seen that mark before, once, a long time ago, on a dead man's saddle. He felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. This wasn't just a story about a struggling woman and a drunk father. This was something else, something older and far more dangerous. He had a choice: ride on and forget what he saw, or step into a world of trouble that had nothing to do with him. He nudged his horse forward, not toward his own ranch, but into the woods that bordered the Callahan property. He was just going to fix a fence. That's what he told himself. Just a few loose boards. But he knew it was a lie. He wasn't just fixing a fence. He was crossing a line. And he had a terrible feeling that once he crossed it, there would be no going back. The next morning, Ruth Callahan stepped onto her porch and froze. A neat stack of freshly cut firewood sat by her steps. No note, no tracks. Just the wood and the clean scent of cedar hanging in the air. Her eyes narrowed. Kindness in Cedar Bluff always came with a price tag, but she knew somehow who had left it. John Lone Tree. The day after that, the sagging gate to her chicken coop stood straight and true, its hinges oiled and reinforced. She stared at it, a strange mix of gratitude and suspicion churning in her gut. "Damn you, Lone Tree," she whispered to the wind. He was a ghost. leaving mended boards, a bundle of jerky, even a new thimble on her windowsill. Always gone before the sun was high. She knew he was watching her place, watching her. And it wasn't just about fixing things. It was about that symbol on the fence post. She'd seen him looking at it. She knew he knew. Finally, she caught him. He was walking her fence line, a coil of wire over his shoulder, his hammer swinging lightly at his hip. He looked up as she stormed off the porch, her hands planted firmly on her hips. "You planning on rebuilding the whole damn place before I get a chance to ask why?" She called out, her voice sharp. He didn't flinch. His gaze was calm, steady. "Didn't figure you needed to ask. And why do it?" He set the wire down. "Because someone should." That stopped her. The simple, honest truth of it. She walked closer, her anger deflating, replaced by a weary curiosity. She studied his face, that quiet, unreadable mask. "What do you want, Lone Tree?" "Nothing you need to give." "Everyone wants something," she shot back. He glanced toward the corner post, the one with the symbol. His eyes were dark, serious. "I saw the mark on your fence." The air went still. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. She wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden chill running through her despite the heat. "It's nothing. Just some old carving." "No," he said, his voice low and certain. "It's not nothing." She looked away, her gaze fixed on the cracked earth at her feet. She was scared. He could see it in the tight line of her jaw, the way her hands were clenched into fists. She was hiding something. "You should stay away from here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This isn't your trouble." "Looks like it might be." Before she could answer, they heard it. The thunder of hooves, fast and heavy, pounding down the road. This wasn't a friendly visit. This was an invasion. 3 men rode into her yard, their horses dark with sweat, their faces harder than the land they rode on. The man in the lead, a slick-looking fella with a cruel twist to his mouth, swung down from his horse. He didn't even glance at Ruth or John. His eyes were fixed on the cabin, where Ruth's father, Samuel, was now standing on the porch, blinking in the harsh light. "Samuel Callahan?" the man asked, his voice like oil on gravel. "Who's asking?" Samuel slurred. The man pulled a folded paper from his vest. "Name's Rogers. I represent Mr. Avery Talcott. You're behind on a note. $55. Ruth felt the world tilt. Talcott. The name was a poison she'd heard her father whisper in his drunken nightmares. The man whose name was tied to that symbol. This wasn't about a simple debt. John knew it. Ruth knew it. Rogers took a step toward the porch, his eyes scanning the property, lingering for a moment too long on the corner fence post. He wasn't just here for money. He was looking for something, and John Lone Tree had the sinking feeling that he and Ruth were standing right in his way. "You got 10 days, old man," Rogers snarled, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. 10 days or Mr. Talcott takes this land, and everything on it." Rogers spat in the dirt, his eyes flicking to John for the first time. It was a look of pure contempt, a dismissal, as if John were no more than a stray dog. Then he and his men wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and fear in their wake. Ruth stood frozen, her face pale. Her father stumbled back into his chair, his hands shaking. But John's eyes were on the road, watching the dust settle. This was an escalation, a clear threat, and the name Avery Talcott was the key. That night, the Callahan cabin was suffocatingly silent. Ruth sat at the table, staring at a ledger full of numbers that would never add up. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. She thought of John, of the quiet strength in his eyes, and she hated herself for the flicker of warmth it gave her. He was getting tangled in a mess that would drown him. The next morning she found him by the river, his hands moving with slow, deliberate grace as he mended a fence. His own fence this time. "You need to go," she said without preamble, her voice tight. He didn't look up. "No." "You heard him. Talcott. This is his business. It's dangerous." "I know the name." That surprised her. She slid off her horse, her heart pounding. "What do you know?" "I know men who work for him are trouble, and I know that mark on your fence is his brand. He doesn't put it on cattle." The unspoken words hung between them. He puts it on property he plans to take, by any means necessary. I didn't come to ask for your help, she said, forcing the words out. I came to warn you away. If you care about me at all, you'll ride out and never look back. He finally looked at her then, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. You think I don't already know what I'm getting into? He took a step closer. You don't owe me anything, Ruth. But sometimes the right thing doesn't wait to be owed. He didn't say what he was going to do. He just tipped his hat, mounted his mare, and rode off toward his own ranch. Ruth watched him go, a storm of fear and a terrifying, unfamiliar hope warring inside her. 3 days passed. 3 days of watching the road, of listening to her father's incoherent muttering about old secrets and bad deals. On the 4th day, a man in a dusty suit rode up. Not Rogers. This one looked like a clerk, with ink-stained fingers and spectacles perched on his nose. The note's been paid, he said, holding out a receipt. In full. Cash. Ruth took the paper, her fingers trembling. By who? The clerk shrugged. A man who sold 10 head of prime cattle at the Laramie auction yesterday. Didn't give a name, just said to clear the Callahan debt. The receipt fluttered from her hand. 10 head, some of his best. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. She rode like a madwoman, the wind tearing at her hair. She found him behind his barn, his hands gentle as he tended to a calf. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the scene in hues of blood and gold. You sold them, she said, her voice choked with a fury she didn't understand. He didn't deny it. 10 head. You shouldn't have. He stood wiping his hands on a rag, his face calm. I didn't do it for your father. You think I don't know that? The words tore from her throat. Did you think I wanted this? For you to sacrifice your future for my past? No one asked you to watch, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. But I did, she cried, taking a step toward him. I saw, and now I have to live with it. A debt I can never repay. He looked at her then, and the quiet calm in his eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, burning intensity. It's not a debt. It was a choice. My choice. He closed the distance between them, his voice dropping to a low growl. I did it because I saw something worth keeping, and I don't wait for permission to protect what's mine. The words struck her like a physical blow. She staggered back, breathless. Mine. Before she could process it, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the road. Not one rider, several. They weren't coming from the direction of town. They were coming from the direction of Talcott's territory. John's hand went to the hilt of the knife on his belt. His body went rigid. Get in the barn, he said, his voice a low command. What is it? Trouble. It was Rogers, and he'd brought 4 more men with him. They rode into John's yard as if they owned it, their faces set in grim lines. This wasn't a social call, and it wasn't about a paid-off debt. Lone Tree, Rogers called out, a smug grin spreading across his face. Funny seeing you here. Seems you've taken an interest in the Callahan property. It's paid for, John said, his voice flat and cold. Your business is done. Rogers laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You think this was about $55? That was just the knock on the door, friend. He swung down from his horse, his men fanning out behind him, creating a half circle. Mr. Talcott doesn't like loose ends, and he doesn't like people getting in his way. The old man was supposed to scare easy. You complicated things. Leave, John said. It was a simple word, but it carried the weight of a death threat. Roger's grin vanished. We're not leaving without what we came for. The old man has something that belongs to Mr. Talcott, something he was paid to keep quiet about. We think his daughter knows where it is. He took a menacing step forward. And now we think you do too. Ruth watched from the shadows of the barn, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it, the real reason. The secret her father had been drinking himself to death to forget. Rogers nodded to his men. Search the place, the barn first. 2 of the men started walking toward the barn, toward her. John didn't hesitate. He moved like a striking snake, a blur of motion. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. He launched himself at the first man, his shoulder connecting with the man's chest with a sickening crunch. The man went down, gasping for air. The second man drew his pistol, but he was too slow. John was already on him, one hand grabbing the gun, the other delivering a brutal, precise blow to the man's throat. The man dropped, choking. It was over in seconds. Two men on the ground, and John standing between them and the barn, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a cold, lethal fire. Rogers and the other two men just stared, their hands hovering over their own guns, a flicker of shock and fear in their eyes. They had underestimated him. Badly. "I said leave," John repeated, his voice a low growl that promised violence. Rogers slowly raised his hands, a new calculating look on his face. "All right, Lone Tree, you win this round." He backed away toward his horse. "But this ain't over. Talcott gets what he wants. Always." They gathered their fallen men and rode off, disappearing into the twilight. John stood there for a long moment, the dust settling around him. Then he turned and walked toward the barn. Ruth stepped out of the shadows to meet him, her whole body shaking. He stopped in front of her. There was a cut on his cheek and his knuckles were raw. "What was that?" she whispered. "What is it they're looking for?" "I don't know," he said, his voice still rough. "But your father does, and we need to find out. Tonight." The truth, when it came, was uglier than anything Ruth could have imagined. They found her father, Samuel, huddled in a corner of his cabin, clutching a near-empty bottle, his eyes wide with a terror that was decades old. "He'll kill me," Samuel whimpered when he saw John. "Talcott will kill me." "He'll kill you anyway if you don't talk," John said, his voice hard but not unkind. He knelt in front of the old man. "What does he want, Samuel?" Piece by broken piece, the story spilled out. 20 years ago, this land, this whole valley, hadn't belonged to a dozen small homesteaders. It had belonged to one man, a prospector named Finch, who had discovered the valley's true treasure. Not gold, but the deep, reliable aquifer that ran beneath it, the source of every well and creek for 50 miles. Avery Talcott, then just a ruthless up-and-comer, wanted that water. He tried to buy Finch out, but Finch refused. So Talcott hired men. There was a fight, a murder. Finch was buried in an unmarked grave, and his claim was forged over to Talcott. But there was a witness, a young carpenter who had been working on Finch's cabin that day, a young man named Samuel Callahan. Talcott hadn't killed him. He'd bought him. He gave Samuel a small parcel of the worst land in the valley and a pouch of gold in exchange for his silence. And for one other thing, the original signed deed to Finch's claim. Talcott, in his arrogance, had let Samuel keep it as a kind of insurance, a reminder of the secret that bound them. "Where is it?" Ruth asked, her voice trembling with disgust and horror. Her father, the man she'd cared for, had been complicit in a murder. Samuel shook his head. "I burned it. Years ago. I swear." John watched the old man's eyes. He was lying. "No, you didn't," John said quietly. "You're too scared to get rid of it. You think it's the only thing keeping him from killing you?" He stood up and walked to the stone fireplace. He ran his hands along the mantel, then down the stones of the hearth. He stopped at one loose stone near the bottom. He pried it out. Inside the dark cavity was a small oilskin-wrapped package. He handed it to Ruth. Her hands shook as she untied the string. Inside was a yellowed, brittle piece of paper. The deed, signed by Jacob Finch. And on the back, in Samuel's own spidery, terrified handwriting, was a full account of the murder he had witnessed. The date, the time, and Avery Talcott's name. It was a confession, and a death warrant. "He knows I have it," Samuel whispered, tears streaming down his face. "He sends Rogers every few years just to remind me. The debt was just an excuse to get inside, to search." Now it all made sense. The symbol on the fence post wasn't a brand of ownership. It was a warning, a marker. "This is my secret. Stay away." "Now we have it," Ruth said, her voice filled with a newfound strength. "We can take this to the sheriff. We can get justice for that man, Finch." John looked at her, his expression grim. "The sheriff in this town is a man named Miller. He's been on Talcott's payroll for a decade. Taking this to him would be like handing Talcott the gun to shoot us with." The hope in Ruth's eyes died. They were trapped. They had the one thing that could destroy Avery Talcott, and there was no one they could give it to. They were holding a stick of dynamite with a lit fuse. "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice small. "First," John said, taking the deed from her and tucking it securely inside his shirt, "we get you and your father away from here." He looked around the small, dilapidated cabin. "Talcott won't stop. He'll burn this place to the ground to find that paper." "Where do we go?" "To my place," he said without hesitation. "It's more remote, more defensible." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not a command, but a promise. "I won't let him get to you." They left that night, under the cover of a moonless sky. John rode with Samuel slumped in front of him, while Ruth followed on her own horse, her belongings tied in a small bundle. They didn't look back. There was nothing left for them there but ghosts. The first few days at John's ranch were tense. Samuel detoxed from the whiskey, his body racked with tremors and his mind with nightmares. Ruth cared for him, her face a mask of weary resolve. She was seeing her father clearly for the first time, not as a victim, but as a coward who had let his fear poison their entire lives. John was a constant, silent presence. He fortified the ranch, reinforcing doors, boarding up windows, checking sight lines from the ridge. He taught Ruth how to load and fire a rifle, his hands firm and steady over hers. "You aim for the chest," he said, his voice low and calm, "and you don't hesitate." They worked together, a quiet rhythm forming between them. They mended fences, tended to the cattle, shared silent meals by the fire. In the space of a few days, their lives had become intertwined in a way that felt both terrifying and inevitable. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun bleed across the horizon, she finally asked the question that had been haunting her. "Why are you doing this, John? This isn't your fight." He didn't answer right away. He just stared out at the land, his land, the place he had built with his own two hands. "My mother was Apache," he said finally. "When my father left, the town treated her like dirt. They called her a squaw. They cheated her at the store. They looked right through her. But she never broke." He turned to look at her, his eyes dark with memory. "She told me once, 'The world will try to make you small. Don't let it. You find one thing, just one thing, that's worth fighting for. And you hold on to it like the earth holds the mountains.'" He paused, his gaze softening. "I'm not fighting for your father's secret, Ruth. I'm fighting for you." Before she could respond, a flicker of movement on the far ridge caught his eye. He stood up slowly, his body going tense. It was a rider, a lone rider, silhouetted against the dying sun. He was just sitting there on his horse watching them. A scout. They weren't alone anymore. Talcott had found them. The waiting was the worst part. Days turned into a week. The lone scout on the ridge was sometimes there, sometimes not. A silent, unnerving presence. John knew they were being watched, their routines noted, their defenses assessed. Talcott wasn't going to send a few thugs this time. When he came, he would come with force. The pressure began to wear on them. Samuel was a ghost, barely speaking, his eyes haunted. Ruth grew thin, her face etched with worry, but her resolve hardened. She practiced with the rifle every day until her shoulder was bruised and her hands were steady. One morning, John rode out to check the northern pasture and found one of his steers lying dead by the creek. There were no marks on it, no signs of a struggle. It was just dead. He knelt, his eyes scanning the ground. The water in the creek looked clear, but there was a faint, unnatural sheen on the surface. He followed the creek upstream, his jaw tight. A mile from his property he found it, the remains of a burlap sack, half submerged in the water, a fine white powder still clinging to the fibers. Poison. It wasn't a disease. It was an attack. Talcott wasn't just trying to drive him out. He was trying to ruin him, to destroy the one thing that gave him independence. His herd, his livelihood, his home. The rage that filled him was cold and clean. This was no longer just about protecting Ruth in the deed. This was about defending his life. He returned to the ranch, his face a grim mask. "He's poisoning the water," he told Ruth. The news hit her like a punch to the gut. This was a new level of evil. This was a war of attrition. By the end of the week, 12 more cattle were dead. The healthy ones were cordoned off, moved to a pasture with a separate well, but the damage was done. John's wealth, the result of years of back-breaking labor, was dying before his eyes. And the town? The town turned on him. Word spread, carried on whispers and poisoned by prejudice. It wasn't Talcott's men killing the cattle, they said. It was the land itself. Lone Tree's land was cursed. That Apache blood of his had soured the soil. The sickness would spread, they said. It would contaminate their own herds, their own wells. No one would sell him supplies. When Ruth rode into town for flour, Mr. Jackson at the store told her he was sold out, even as she watched him stack fresh sacks on the shelf. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Mather, saw her on the street and crossed to the other side, pulling her children close. They were completely, utterly alone, isolated by fear and hatred, a perfect target. That night, a deep exhaustion settled over John. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames, the weight of it all pressing down on him. The poisoned land, the dead cattle, the town's betrayal, the coming violence. He felt the edges of his control beginning to fray. "Maybe we should just give him the deed," Ruth said softly from behind him. "Maybe he'd let us go." "No," John said, his voice raw. "He'd kill us all, to be sure. This only ends one way." "I'm tired of fighting, John." "So am I." She came and knelt in front of him, taking his calloused hands in hers. They were trembling. "Look at me," she said, her voice fierce. She waited until his eyes met hers. "The cattle are dying. The town hates us. But we are still here. This land is still under our feet. What you built here isn't just fences and a barn. It's this." She pressed his hand to her heart. "And he can't poison that. He can't burn it down. Do you hear me?" A single, ragged breath escaped his lips. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. "I hear you," he whispered. Just then, the sound they had been dreading for weeks finally came. The sound of dozens of horses moving fast, surrounding the ranch. The siege had begun. The attack came just before dawn, the gray light filled with the shouts of men and the crack of rifle fire. John and Ruth were ready. They returned fire from the windows of the fortified cabin, their shots precise and measured. Samuel, to their surprise, was not cowering. He was loading rifles, his hands shaky but his movements surprisingly deft, a lifetime of muscle memory from his youth kicking in. There were at least a dozen of them, led by Rogers. They used a wagon for cover, inching it closer and closer to the cabin. "They're going to burn us out," Ruth yelled over the din. "Not if I can help it," John said. He grabbed a bundle of dynamite sticks he'd kept for clearing stumps. "Cover me." He slipped out the back door while Ruth and Samuel laid down, suppressing fire. He moved through the shadows like a wraith, circling around to the ridge that overlooked the attackers. From his vantage point, he could see their whole formation. They were careless, confident. He lit the fuse. He counted, and he threw. The explosion was deafening. It didn't hit the men, but it ripped the wagon to shreds and sent their horses screaming in terror. The element of surprise was gone. Their cover was gone. The attackers, disoriented and panicked, fell back. The first wave was over, but they knew it was only a temporary victory. Talcott himself was out there. John had seen him on a fine black horse, watching from a safe distance, a general commanding his troops. He wouldn't give up so easily. They held out for 2 days of sporadic gunfire, of dwindling ammunition and sleepless nights. The water in the barrels was running low. They were trapped. On the third morning, a voice called out from the trees. It was Rogers. "Lone Tree! Talcott wants to make a deal." "I'm not dealing," John shouted back. "He's not asking you. He's talking to the girl." Rogers' voice was slick with malice. "He says he'll let you and the old man ride out of here, free and clear. All he wants is the girl, and the deed she's carrying." Ruth's blood ran cold. The deed wasn't in her possession. It was still tucked safely in John's shirt. This was a lie. A trick. But why? John looked at Ruth, his eyes hard. "He's trying to split us up. He thinks you're my weakness." "Are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He reached out and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a smudge of gunpowder. "No, he said softly. You're my strength. Then his eyes shifted, looking past her, a new, dangerous idea dawning in them. But maybe, he said, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. We can use that. What are you thinking? He wants a trade, John said, his voice low and intense. Let's give him one. An hour later, a white flag, a piece of Ruth's petticoat tied to a rifle, appeared in the cabin window. We'll do it, John shouted. The deed for our lives. We meet in the open. Just me, the girl, and Talcott, no one else. There was a long silence. Then Roger's voice came back. He agrees. High noon, in the middle of the pasture. Ruth looked at John, her heart pounding with fear. This is insane. He'll kill us both. Trust me, John said, his eyes glinting with a light she had never seen before. He's not the only one who knows how to set a trap. As the sun reached its zenith, John and Ruth walked out of the cabin, their hands raised. Ruth held the oilskin package in her hand, a decoy. The real deed was still with John. Across the wide open pasture, Avery Talcott dismounted from his horse, Rogers at his side. They were alone just as agreed, but John knew their men were hidden in the trees, their rifles aimed, waiting for the signal. You've caused me a great deal of trouble, Mr. Lone Tree, Talcott said, his voice calm and cultured, a chilling contrast to the violence he commanded. A waste of time and resources. Give us a horse and let us ride out, John said. The deed is yours. Talcott smiled, a cold, predatory expression. Of course. He gestured for Ruth to approach. The package first, my dear. Ruth took a deep breath and started walking toward him, her steps slow and deliberate. John stayed put, his body coiled like a spring. The air was thick with tension, a silent countdown to bloodshed. This was the moment, the trap. But it wasn't John's trap that sprung first. From the east, from the direction of town, came a sudden, thunderous noise, the sound of dozens of horses riding hard, not Talcott's men. Over the rise came a group of riders. At the front were two Apache men, their faces grim, their rifles held ready. One of them John recognized with a jolt of shock. It was his cousin Joseph. Behind them were two Mexican vaqueros John knew from a neighboring ranch. And behind them were the men of Cedar Bluff, farmers, ranchers, even old Mr. Jackson from the feed store, armed with shotguns and hunting rifles. They rode not as a mob, but as an army, fanning out to form a wide, inescapable circle around Talcott and his men. Talcott stared, his composure finally cracking. What is this? He hissed. One of the vaqueros, a wiry man named Mateo, rode forward. He looked not at Talcott, but at John. Your father, he said, nodding toward the cabin where Samuel was watching from a window. He found a way to get a message to my son last night. He told us everything, about Finch, about the poison. Joseph, John's cousin, rode up beside Mateo. We heard you were in trouble, he said simply, his eyes locking with John's. Family does not stand alone. Then Mr. Jackson, his face pale but determined, spoke, his voice shaking with anger. We may have been fools, Lone Tree. We may have listened to whispers and let fear guide us. But we are not murderers. And we don't let men like him, he jerked his head toward Talcott, poison our land and our people. Rogers and Talcott were surrounded. Their hidden men were outnumbered 10-1. It was over. Talcott, realizing he was beaten, made one last, desperate move. He lunged for Ruth, pulling a derringer from his boot, but he never reached her. A single shot rang out, clean and true. Not from the riders, from the cabin porch. Talcott crumpled to the ground, clutching a bleeding shoulder, his eyes wide with disbelief. On the porch, Samuel Callahan stood tall, a smoking rifle in his hands. The tremors gone, his eyes clear for the first time in 20 years. Justice had come to Cedar Bluff. Avery Talcott didn't hang, but he might as well have. With the deed and Samuel's testimony, corroborated by a dozen ranchers who now understood who had been poisoning their valley's water source, he was ruined. His empire crumbled, his bought and paid for sheriff was run out of town on a rail, and he would spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. The land began to heal, and so did the people. The morning after Talcott was taken away, Joseph Lone Tree and his men arrived not with guns, but with sacks of grain, goats, and bundles of herbs. They didn't offer words of pity. They just started working, helping John clear the dead cattle and purify the creek. The next day, Mateo and the vaqueros came, bringing lumber to help rebuild the barn. Then the townsfolk started to arrive in ones and twos. They brought food, tools, and a quiet, shamefaced respect. They worked alongside the Apache, alongside the Mexicans, their shared labor mending more than just fences. The place stopped being Lone Tree's Ranch. People started calling it the Ridge, and everyone knew it belonged to them all. Ruth reopened her bread stand, and this time there was a line. She started teaching children to read on Sundays, her first students a mix of white, Mexican, and Apache kids, all learning together under a shady oak tree. Her father Samuel found a different kind of salvation. He never touched another bottle, but he found purpose in his hands again, mending chairs, reinforcing porch steps. His quiet work a long, slow apology for the silence he had kept for too long. One evening late in the fall, Ruth and John stood at the edge of the pasture, watching the new grass begin to sprout in the fire-scorched earth. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of cedar and turning leaves. "It's funny," Ruth said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I spent my whole life thinking I was just trying to survive. I never realized I was planting roots." John took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. It felt right, solid. "We didn't just survive, Ruth," he said, his voice low. "We built a home." She turned to him, her green eyes shining in the twilight. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, gentle kiss that held no desperation, no fear. Only the quiet promise of 1,000 sunrises to come. It wasn't a lightning strike. It was the slow, steady growth of a deep-rooted tree. They were married by the land, by the fire they had endured, and by the community they had unknowingly forged. They had faced down evil, and in the ashes, they had found not just love, but a place to belong. Thank you for staying with me through John and Ruth's incredible journey. Their story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about standing alone, but about finding those worth standing with. If you were moved by their story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know you want to hear more tales of courage, love, and the enduring power of the human spirit. I'll see you in the next one.